Welcome, everybody, to Five Gyre State of the Science 2022. We're going to give everybody just a couple minutes to join here, so please sit tight. We're super excited to have you. And while we're waiting for people to join, we titled this Toward a Global Treaty, so State of the Science Toward a Global Treaty, since we do have the UN Global Treaty Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee #1 coming up in just about a week and a half here. So that's getting teed up real soon. For those of you that aren't in the loop, we'll discuss that briefly during our State of the Science chat today. So just give us about another minute and we'll get right into it. And while we're waiting, Patty, did you say you were in the middle of a snowstorm?
Yeah, we have been in the middle of a snowstorm here in Stockholm for the past 2 days, or actually not since Saturday. So it's so weird because it's not supposed to snow this way in Sweden or in Stockholm at this time of the year. So it's just like crazy.
Have you been making snow? Have you been making snow people or snow angels or anything?
Yeah, actually, my neighbors did a big snowman.
Very cool.
I'm going to the ANC on Wednesday, so I'm just like.
You're getting prep. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thanks, Patty.
Yeah. And I'm sure we will have some people rolling in over the next couple minutes here, but let's just go ahead and get started. So again, everybody, welcome to Five Gyre's State of the Science 2022, looking toward a global treaty. My name is Michael Doshi. I go by just my last name, Doshi. I am working as the science communication lead at Five Gyres. I've been involved in the plastic pollution space since 2014, so about 8 years, dipping my hands into everything from sailing the high seas in the South Pacific Gyre, conducting research with Captain Charles Moore, to doing waste investigations in Southeast Asia that actually ended up in the Emmy-winning film, The Story of Plastic, to working in California coastline research and helping to spearhead the creation of international youth summits during my time at Algalita. So I'll be moderating this panel over the next hour, and we have two amazing panelists with us today. And first, I'd like to introduce Lisa Erdl. Lisa is the Director of Science and Innovation at the Five Gyres Institute. She is a microplastics researcher and is passionate about keeping waterways clean for wildlife and people. Lisa completed her PhD at the University of Toronto, where her research focused on the sources, fates, and effects of microplastics in the environment. So our conversation today is actually going to really focus on that specifically, the sources and fate, effects, and solutions to plastic pollution. Welcome, Lisa. We'll hear from you in just a minute. Next, I'd like to introduce Patty Villarrubia Gomez. Patty is a PhD candidate doing a collaborative project between the Stockholm Resilience Center and Gothenburg University in Sweden, and also in partnership with the Five Gyres Institute. She is particularly interested in Earth system governance and planetary boundaries, understanding the science, policy, society interfaces and their power dynamics through looking through the lens of intersectionality and environmental justice. She's a science activist and sees science communication as a pivotal part of her research to reach broader audiences. Welcome, Patty. Before we get into the meat of our discussion today, I wanted to let everybody know that we will have time for a Q&A at the end of the discussion. So feel free to drop your questions in the comments, and we hope to get to all of them near the end of our conversation. And I'm going to kick it over to Lisa to set the tone a bit more for what we're doing at Five Gyres and leading into 2023 and the future of our research.
Thanks, Doshi. I just had a couple of quick comments to help set the stage, because we've really seen that the plastic pollution issue has grown. The science that I'm very much involved in is progressing at what seems to be a lightning speed. And there is really this global awareness that has grown. We've seen this in advocacy, in corporations, and also in public interest in the issue. There's really this groundswell of support to tackle plastic pollution. And we see this global treaty on plastic on the table, which Patty will be at next week. But we still need solutions that work. There's been an overwhelming amount of false statements and misleading information in this space, and that makes action really challenging. For example, we've seen business leaders that ask for science-based vetting on new material innovations like biomaterials, but evaluating claims can be a real challenge. And the public, we all want effective solutions. We don't want regrettable substitutions, and there needs to be effective implementation of strategies that don't harm the most vulnerable communities and who have been most at risk. So as an organization focused on science to help inform solutions, Five Gyres is really committed to vetting solutions and leading some of this research. Even though Five Gyres is historically known as an ocean-focused organization, we've set sail in 20 expeditions, we've gone around the world, we know that solutions are much more effective close to the source. There's a dizzying array of different polymers, uses of plastic in society, different leakage points, different additives that are chemicals and sorbed chemicals. And thus there are a whole suite of targeted solutions, and there's no one-size-fits-all strategy. So our focus over the next several years as an organization will focus on evaluating solutions. We're vetting innovation claims, we're deconstructing the complexity of plastic pollution into different sectors of use in society, because we know that solutions for textiles will differ from solutions to tire wear particles or single-use plastics or fishing gear in the ocean. And so I'm really excited to have this opportunity to set the stage for the conversation today, to dive into the science in the plastic pollution world and really discuss with Patty how the science can help drive solutions. And very, very fresh on our minds is what will be happening in Uruguay next week.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And for those of you who are just joining, welcome to Five Gyres State of the Science 2022. On today's discussion, we have our two esteemed panelists, Dr. Lisa Erdahl and PhD candidate Patty Villarrubia Gomez. Please drop any questions you might have into the comment section, and we hope to get to all of them at the end of our discussion. And let's go ahead and kick it off. And the first discussion topic I want to start with is around sources. And Lisa, this first question is for you. What do we know about the sources of microplastics into the environment? And how has our understanding of the issue grown in recent years?
Yeah, our understanding of the microplastics issue has really grown in recent years, especially as we started going down to smaller and smaller size fractions, looking at microplastics not only in the surface water of the oceans, but looking in sediment, in wildlife, in air. And what we see is that there are many different types of microplastics. It's really this diverse suite of contaminants. And when you look at the types of microplastics that are in sediment versus in the surface of the water or in the air, you see very different types of particles. You see different polymers, different sizes, different shapes, each with their own set of chemical additives. And this really leads us to understanding that it's a much more complex issue than just a single type of plastic. There's many different leakage points. And these different plastic particles can have social, environmental, and economic harm all the way from the production of that plastic to when it ends up in the environment. So for example, we see tire dust. We see a lot of these tire wear particles when we look at stormwater and in sediment that are nearby roads and nearby communities. We don't see a lot of tire particles, say in the middle of the oceans. We see a lot of fishing gear there. Whereas microfibers, we see that in wastewater, we see it in stormwater, and a solution for textiles like a filter on a washing machine or a filter on a dryer would be really different from the kind of catchment that's needed for tires or material redesign. So really, as we've start to find the chemical fingerprints for these microplastics that they're in the environment, they're really opening up this Pandora's box of all the different types of plastic that's getting into the environment. and leading us to find solutions for each one of those. It's not just a single-use plastic issue. There's many different types of plastic and then many different types of solutions.
Thanks, Lisa. I was going to ask this a bit later in the discussion, but I think since we just jumped right into it with the different sectors and different types of microplastics and also different types of polymers, could you give our listeners a bit more context on the sizes that we're actually talking about? The word microplastics is thrown around all the time. Some people might even be reading the word nanoparticles or nanoplastics in a lot of these articles that are coming out about plastics in the human body and how it's affecting human health. So could you provide our listeners with a bit more context to the actual sizes that you're describing?
Yeah, and I think this is really, really key to get a sense of scale of the particles that we're talking about. Microplastics are particles smaller than 5 millimeters in size, so something smaller than the tip of an eraser on a pencil. Some of these microplastics you can see with your naked eye, like nurdles, or you can see microfibers floating around in the air if it's sunny and there's a beam of light shining through. You can see floating dust. A lot of those are microfibers. But when we talk about nanoplastics, this is smaller than 1 micron. It's smaller than a red blood cell. It's around the same size as a single bacterium. So these are very, very small particles. And one challenge when we are talking about these small particles, smaller than bacteria, is that they're really hard to see. We can look for their chemical signature. A lot of new techniques are being developed to find the chemical signature of plastics, say in blood, but we're not actually looking at the physical particles like we do for microplastics. With microplastics, we can see them under a microscope. Nanoplastics are very, very small. So the field is really developing new techniques to find these small plastics and see where they're ending up in the environment, because we know very little still about these very small microplastics and nanoplastics because they're very challenging to try to collect.
Thanks for that insight, Lisa. It gets to be a bit mind-boggling when you're thinking about how small these get, when you're talking about the size of a blood cell and how hard it might actually be to do a lot of the science research on these materials once they get to that size. So thanks for that. Patty, a follow-up question in regards to the sectors that Lisa was talking about. Are there some sectors that have received more attention than others? And what are some of the gaps, I guess, Lisa, as well, what are some of the gaps that you're both seeing in the research?
But when you talk about sectors, do you mean specifically different kinds of the use of plastics or fields within research?
We're looking at the research for specific sectors. So such as researching fishing gear. Fishing gear itself is going to be a different sector than household goods, such as personal care goods. So that's what we're looking at is, or for example, single-use plastics that might be used in the food industry and packaging industry. So those are some couple examples of the sectors.
So, right, you have it, right? I believe like most of the things that we can see when we talk about plastics is the end, like are focusing on the end of life of these products, mostly single-use plastics. And we also hear more about fishing gear, and I believe that that's because those are really, really visible problems.
Mm-hmm.
It's in comparison to nanoplastics, for instance, it's really just there in front of our eyes, wherever you go right now, from the city, like very like in the middle of the city, or right in the middle of nowhere, in places that are very remote. Wherever you go, you have single-use plastic that has drifted onto the ocean. And talking about the ocean, that's another thing. We know a lot about what plastics, what happened to plastics once they are in the ocean, but it was until very recently that we have not seen so much research inland. And that's still, we can see a lot of that in the INC, in the International Committee, in the International Negotiation Committee. When we read about reports that some member states are putting out there, they mention a lot the marine environment, but plastics are everywhere, and from as Lisa said, like very big chunk of plastics to the nanoparticles, and the conversation keeps revolving about single-use plastics, consumer behavior, and the end life of plastic.
Mm-hmm.
There's some bits and pieces of research that it's growing, and it's growing fast in my opinion, but not fast enough about, or not the research itself, but it's not the how do you say, the intention from like all different actors is not yet in the production of the raw sources, the raw materials for producing plastics. There we have a gap because the global scale at that having an impact on the planet is the planet, and we have to link plastic at the root cause of the problem and not at the end of life. If we look into if we look into solutions, this like variety of solutions that Lisa was mentioning that are needed, they are very needed at the very beginning of the life cycle, which is the extraction of resource and material, gas and oil. We have to look at if we want to understand the
Thanks, Patty. Lisa, did you have anything you wanted to chime in with real quick before we move on?
Yeah, I think that Patty's note that really the discussions have been focused on consumer behavior, single-use plastics, and the marine environment is very astute. And we've seen this for a long time, that industry has wanted to deflect attention away from themselves and put the focus more on consumers. So I think this is a very intentional move. Single-use plastics are, of course, a very visible type of plastic, but we know that it's not always the most common type of plastic we see in the environment. And when we talk about different environments, marine has got a ton of focus. I think the issue of plastic really galvanized the public. It was alarming. It was very surprising to many 10 years ago, but in the last decade, we've really started to focus, like Patty mentioned, on terrestrial environments, on air, close to communities that are near extraction sites or production facilities. And we know it's way more than just an oceans issue. And as an organization that really started in the oceans, our roots are there. We've really advocated for a focus for this global treaty to be not on the oceans, to be on the full life cycle of plastic and looking at all environments.
And if not something, I think that apart from at the very beginning of the production, link that is on the chemicals that we use to produce plastic, the toxicity that we are getting, all these chemicals that are additives, the additives and the plasticizers, that the industry put into plastic to give the special characteristics that these 100 different types of plastic needs, right? But I that we're hearing a lot about, it's more than 10,000 different chemicals conforming plastics, and we know very little about how these plastic have an effect at ecotoxicological level. So there is a very big gap both in research, independent research, and the intention of different actors and governments to know more and to integrate this within legislation, either because it's complex or because intentionally they don't want to look at it. So this is why we are trying more and more to bring into the conversation the need of having to have chemicals and their toxicity into the conversation of the life.
Thanks, Patty. That's a really good point, and we're actually going to dive a bit into the chemicals issue with plastics in just a little bit here in the discussion. So thanks for teeing that up early on. For those of you who are just joining now, over the next 40 minutes, we will continue to discuss topics relating to recent research on plastic pollution and what it looks like from the research perspective moving into 2023 and the years to come. And this is, like I said, this is going to be live. We got about 40 minutes left. And Patty, I actually wanted to kick it back over to you, since you were really emphasizing this being a global issue. As you know, five gyres, as Lisa had mentioned, had historically, our research had been in the five subtropical gyres of the planet. So we actually do have an updated global estimate paper that will be published early next year, fingers crossed for early next year. That's going to be looking at 40 years of trends and data from sampling around the world. So for those who are really still focused on ocean plastic pollution, that paper will help to feed your knowledge on the new global estimate. But looking at the full biosphere of the planet, you recently worked on a paper that was focusing on specifically planetary boundaries. Could you talk us through a bit more on what that means, planetary boundaries, and what does this proliferation of plastic mean for our planet really at the global scale?
Yeah, so the paper that you are mentioning is this second paper we published on plastics and planetary boundaries, the third if we include the chemicals as novel entities. And in this last paper we talk about how, and we have research about how, what is the knowledge, what are the early evidences that we have on how plastic has an impact, not only at a planetary scale, but at basic Earth system processes like the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the land change, the movement of biogeochemical flows around the planet. All those processes that allow the planet to work in the way they do naturally, how plastic have an impact on that. And we didn't do anything that much special. What we did was taking the knowledge and early evidences that scientists have been building up for the past 20 years and 20, 30 years, and connecting how plastic are not only having an impact in all the planetary boundaries, which I will explain now, but also how they impact all of them and exacerbate the impact, and it can exacerbate the impact on other planetary boundaries. So when we talk about planetary boundaries, just a historical recap, the planetary boundaries framework is a sustainability framework that was created in 2009 by a group of international scientists that they defined what were 9 of the most important and pressuring environmental pressures that we are facing now on the Anthropocene, in what we call the Anthropocene, which is the era where we have all these changes created by the exacerbation activities of humans, and we are leading what is happening today, to put it in a very plain language way. And they defined certain thresholds or limits that were based on Holocene, where the Earth era, where we were before the Anthropocene, where all this were stable and we could thrive as humanity, right? And as we know right now. And they decided these 9 different boundaries, which were climate change, biodiversity loss, land system, novel entities, among others. And novel entities and chemical pollution was one of the boundaries. And plastic is not a boundary itself. Plastic falls under the novel entities. And novel entities are all these chemicals that are man-made created, human created, or other organisms that are also created by humans, or also natural elements that we are using in ways that were not used before, and now they are transported in a different. So all of that are novel entities, and many of them are chemical pollutants. For instance, many of the pesticides and antibiotics and plastic and their chemical additives are novel entities. Mm-hmm. So we took all the information, and so again, I just recap a little bit because it was a big answer. How these plastics and their chemicals have an impact on each one of the different planetary boundaries, and how they impact are not only directed to one boundary, but how they link to other boundaries and exacerbate the impacts in them. For instance, plastic is it's a fossil fuel based material, so the implications on climate change are very big. So
thanks, Patty. Yeah, let me ask 2 follow-up questions to that real quick, or actually a statement and then a question. I've heard that the Anthropocene, plastic is going to be one of the markers of the Anthropocene. So in years and years to come, millennia to come, plastic is going to be there as one of the markers in the environment for researchers to be able to see this is the beginning of the Anthropocene. I did want to ask a follow-up question because you were talking about these novel entities, plastics and chemicals. Is in your research and in putting this paper together, is there a safe concentration of plastic in the environment? And how is this different compared to carbon emissions or other discussions around global change?
Yeah, this is actually a very good question, Doshi, because the other boundaries, the other planetary boundaries are like easier between brackets, right? To measure them and to put limits to it, because normally, for instance, if we get climate change, we know that the limit is for temperature increase is 1.5 degrees that we're hearing a lot about now with climate change. So it's like one concentration, one physical pressure. In the case of plastics and novel entities, we are talking about hundreds of thousand different kinds of chemicals. In each one of these chemicals and each one of these organisms have different toxicity thresholds. They behave differently, and not only that they are like these 100,000 different ones, but also when they are released into the environment, they are combined. They create new compositions that we don't even know. Another thing with novel entities and with chemicals precisely is that we're finding that we have no good idea of what are the ingredients that plastic are made of, because that chemical formula belongs to the copyright or how is that?
Proprietary information. So just to give our viewers an example of that, just like Coca-Cola or Pepsi might not actually give all the ingredients of their formula. They don't want other people to have it. When you buy an item that's in a plastic container or packaging, they might tell you, hey, this is a number 1 PET, or this is a number 2 HDPE, but they're not telling you what are the actual chemical ingredients that go into that material. We can know the polymer type, but they're not being open with all the different chemicals that are going into the plastics, and nor our researchers are in the infancy stages of seeing what happens when you combine all these different chemicals and what the outcomes can be, as Patty is mentioning.
Exactly. So it's very hard to put a limit, to put a number or an average number for novel entities, because which one are you going to take? It's not the same PFOS chemical, a chemical in the families of the PFAS is not the same as BP as the bisphenols, right? They different, or a flame retardant, or it's very, very difficult to say I'm going to take the concentration of this one, because maybe the concentration of that specific chemical, for a very, very small concentration, you can have impact in an animal or a person. Maybe not, but like we're going to be willing to put an just for one chemical when there are hundreds of thousands. We particularly the research working in our team, we don't believe that is the way. We keep hearing and being asked to come up with numbers, but maybe these are not the numbers that we need to come up with. We have set up different, or trying to define different control variables from production, through the whole life cycle of the materials, from production to release into the environment and earth system. but we will be researching more about this in the next year. But right now, we cannot say which number for variable or not. That needs to be looked upon.
Thanks, Patty, for explaining how complex this really starts to get as you peel back more layers of the onion. I want to keep us moving on. And Lisa, I want to direct this next question to you, actually still on the topic of chemicals, because that seems to be popping up in a lot of the articles that are coming out today that are public facing. What are the direct links between microplastics and chemicals in the environment?
Yeah, they're closely linked. And we are seeing a rise in interest in chemicals because it seems to be one of the major causes of effects from microplastics. There are physical effects of microplastics, but a large driving force of the effects of some of these microplastics are the chemical leachates, the chemical effects that are coming from these microplastics. We know that the chemicals in plastic, they're found in habitats and wildlife really at a global scale. Many of these chemicals and particles are so lightweight that they can move from more temperate regions where we use a lot of plastic, where we use a lot of synthetic chemicals, and can find their way to the Arctic or Antarctic. It's not because there's a huge amount of production or even use there, but these chemicals are so lightweight they can be carried in air at a global level. And just as not all pesticides are the same, there are thousands and thousands of different pesticides. Microplastics are not all the same. There are hundreds of thousands of different synthetic chemicals, somewhere in the order of many thousands, over 10,000, that can be included as plastic additives. We have robust toxicity data for a few dozen. And then still, little information on what are the chronic effects of those chemicals. So they follow similar pathways. They're extracted from fossil fuels, chemicals, and microplastics. A lot of them are mixed in together, and microplastics can be a vector of these additive chemicals to wildlife. But we still lack a lot of information on what those effects of the microplastics and the chemicals are. And we learned from lead, for example, that there's really no safe level. And as the research for a lot of these plastic additives is improving, and we're starting to investigate what the effects are, the quote unquote safe level seems to be lowering and lowering. So to follow up on Patty's point, to try to set a safe level is really difficult. We don't know if there is a safe level of these chemical additives and microplastics.
Yeah, it's heavy stuff when you start thinking about it. Thank you, Lisa. For everybody who's watching, this is being recorded. I do see some people are having issues with the video jumping them back to the beginning. So if that's happening to you, go ahead and refresh your browser and it should catch you up to speed. Patty and Lisa, this is a great, robust discussion. We have about 27 minutes left, and I would love to leave some time for Q&A from the audience. So if you could look to keep your answers to 1 to 2 minutes max, that would be great moving forward. Lisa, jumping into future thinking, and actually we've been doing some research on this topic over the past 18 months, and we have some planned going into 2023. Bioplastics. Everybody thinks of bioplastics in the future, but it's happening right now. So actually, instead of calling it bioplastics, I like to look at it as alternative materials, because there is a lot of debate on should these bio-based materials be actually called plastic or not. And we don't need to fully get into that now, but in regards to these alternative materials, are they a source of plastic pollution to the environment?
It's complex. Some of them are. Some of these polymers are behaving a lot like traditional plastics. When we look at PLA, for example, it can remain in the environment on the order of years. The study that we just wrapped up was looking at 22 different bioplastics in 6 different environments and looked at the degradation rates. PLA degrades really slowly. Novel bio-based alternatives like PHA seems to degrade much more quickly. Of course, there's still the question mark of toxicity. If you're inundating these novel materials with plasticizers and dyes that can cause toxicity. It can also cause harm. It can cause harm through those leachates if they're ingested by wildlife, or even just leaching into the surrounding water. So it's important definitely to consider these novel materials and what's the realistic mixture of chemicals. But some of them do behave very differently to plastic. So I think that the jury is still out as to whether or not this is plastic or not. Many of them seem to be quite different from plastic. And if we can show that there's no toxicity of these materials, then I think it could be an effective solution.
And keep your eyes and ears open in early 2023 for our Better Alternatives 3.0 report that will be coming out, looking at a lot of these materials that are known as bioplastics, including one that's really being amplified right now, known as PHA and PHB, as a biodegradable or compostable plastic. So stay tuned for that research in 2023. And Lisa, we are going to continue 5 Gyres as an organization to work on more research on this topic specifically. And I know you had been talking about the ecotoxicology quite a bit. Could you give people just a kind of layman's or ecotoxicology 101, and what does that actually mean in relation to plastic pollution and research?
Yeah, looking at the effects of plastic on wildlife, essentially. So we know that these new materials like PHA and PHB can break down in the environment, but what are the additives that are included in those materials to give them shelf life or be UV resistant? Since we know that for other types of plastic, that it can be these additives that are really driving the toxicity. So it's essential when we're developing new materials to look at not only what's its fate in the environment, does it break down, but to look at what could be the unintended consequences of some of these added chemicals, and making sure they're not more of a problem than they are a benefit.
Great. Thank you so much for that. And another way to look at this too is, are we plastifying the planet in ways that we don't know through the chemicals that might be leaching from even the bioplastics or alternative materials? So it's going to be some interesting research coming from 5 Gyres and partners in the coming years surrounding that. I want to move the discussion on to more of the effects of plastic pollution. Mm-hmm. And here's a pretty broad question for Lisa or Patty, whoever would like to answer. But how are the different environments impacted by the presence of plastic? And how does this vary when you consider these in different sectors of plastic use in society? I mean, everybody knows the ocean is downstream from everything. So if you live in a coastal city, Lisa, you talked about tire dust. The rain will eventually wash that tire dust either into the ocean or into a lake if you're surrounding that area. But some places it won't. So we do have different plastic pollution from different sectors in different environments. So again, answer this as broadly as you would like, but how are different environments impacted by the presence of plastic?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting to look at these different types of environments and how the presence of plastic really differs. Like you mentioned, there is a lot of tire wear particles, this plastic rubber that's running off of roads. And we know that rubber, it can contain tens of thousands of synthetic chemicals, many that are known to be carcinogenic and toxic. So the effects to local organisms, like insects that live in streams, can be really profound. We know that 6-ppd quinone, for example, from tires can cause toxicity to salmon. It's one of the most lethal chemicals that have been tested to date. So that effect can be very different from a sector like textiles. Fibers can shed from clothing. Microfibers are one of the most common types of microplastics when we look at animals, when we look at water, when we look at air. And because of that use of plastic in society, in our clothing, with how common it is in society and how many microfibers are emitted to air, these are some of the most common particles that are getting into humans. They're one of the most common types of particles that are found in our lungs. And so the solutions for textiles will really differ. We might want to try to limit the sheer volume of microfibers getting into the environment through filtration. But a solution for tires might be eliminating some of those more harmful chemicals or capturing it close to the source, designing tires to shed fewer microplastics. So when we look at the different environments where we've studied microplastics, each has its own unique fingerprint of what types of microplastics are there, and that can really, when we trace it back, it informs what sort of solutions we would want to implement.
Thanks, Lisa. Before we jump further into the solutions questions or portion of this discussion, Patty, I know your PhD research touched on this next topic quite a bit. So I actually wanted to just kick it over to you for this. But what are some of the equity issues around only seeing plastic pollution as a waste problem? And yeah, tell us a bit more about your research and how it relates to the injustice to communities when we take this narrow point of view.
So that is exactly what I was going to add to Lisa's Lisa's answer, and is that when we talk about plastics, and this links also to your first questions, what are the things that are not so looked into when we talk about research or policy? And it's something that more attention, but it needs even more. And it's not only what are the environmental impacts of plastic pollution, or we can say environmental because when it comes to nature, because we humans are part of nature, and we should not be decoupling us from natural environments, because we created a different kind of natural environment, and there is nature all around us. And when we talk about cities, there will be different kinds of impacts depending the city you live on, and depending the part of the city that you live on, depending in many cases your socioeconomic status and where you come from and your skin color and your country itself. We, and I say we, from the global north, or countries with that are economically wealthier, we have a tendency historically to send most of our recyclables outside, to outsource that problem to countries that we know that they don't have the facilities, the appropriate facilities to recycle those products. Before, it was China, and suddenly when the Chinese government decided to cut off the recycling materials going into their country, it went directly to neighboring countries like Indonesia, Thailand, and it's creating really, really big issues, not only in the environment, but also at the health level. And not only health level, like at the organism, but also mental problems. Because imagine living around, like going to the street where you used to play, and now it's full of trash coming from other countries. And or being a kid playing on the street, and you cannot, because of the fumes of plastic being burned, you are breathing that toxic air, and you have to come outside. There was the other day I read an article saying that birds around certain areas are dying, because like doves were dying, like they don't die with anything. And now they are dying because of the when it's is burned. And if that is happening to animals' health.
We've lost Patty here for just a second. If she jumps back in, we will bring her back into the fold of the discussion. But something in regards to the injustice we're seeing, both environmental injustices and social injustices with plastic pollution, is that it is fully a global issue, and there are different actors playing different roles in the proliferation of this. And that's going to be a huge part of the discussion at the upcoming global treaty negotiations, which will be happening over the next 2 years. And Patty will indeed be present to discuss more of her research on this, as well as her planetary boundaries paper that just came out. And if you want to learn more about the waste trade that Patty was discussing and open pit burning, The Story of Plastic is a great documentary to check out that kind of explains the full life cycles of plastics and the externalized negative consequences to a lot of developing countries. So let's kick the discussion over to solutions now. And I know this is where a lot of people tend to focus on, because there's so many new innovations popping up all the time. And a lot of people don't know what to grab onto. Lisa, in your opening statements, you had actually touched on there being a lot of misleading information or untrue information. And from a consumer facing side, community members, they see this as their way of potentially contributing to solutions. Buy this eco-friendly plastic, buy this bioplastic, buy this material that's made from recycled water bottles or whatever it might be. We're not, for this portion of the discussion, we're not really focused on those types of solutions. We're focused on more systemic type solutions, or even what are the ways of potentially stopping these plastic particles from entering the environment or people in the first place. So Lisa, what are some of the innovations you have seen to prevent microplastic and chemicals from getting into the environment recently? Do you have anything that really jumps out to you that you get really excited about and want to communicate to the broader audience?
Yeah, one really effective solution that we've seen recently is filtration of microfibers by adding filters to washing machines. Five Dryers is doing research right now to look at dryers as another emission source. In North America, we use a lot of clothing dryers and laundering, and doing science right now to help inform solutions like capturing microfibers in dryer filters. Solutions are not always buy this new thing, which is sometimes what we see a lot. We get advertised to that this one thing that we buy can be the solution. Of course, material redesigns are really important to help solving the plastic pollution crisis. We see that material innovations in thin films for single-use plastics, for example, can be really effective, but a lot of benefit can be gained from improved waste management, like filters on washing machines, rain gardens, on roads to filter out tire particles, or bans on harmful single-use plastics, certain polymers that are harder to recycle or can be more toxic. And there's really going to be this suite of solutions. When we break up the plastic pollution issue into these different sectors of use in society, a solution for microbeads was a ban on those in personal care products. But that'll be really different from the solutions for textiles, the solutions for tires, for durable goods, for electronics. So it's really important to look at this sort of menu of different solutions. Is the solution material redesign? Is it a ban? Is it improved waste management? Or is it all three? So looking to what's known, now we know a lot more about sources and the fate of these particles in the environment. It's time to look to the solutions.
Thanks, Lisa. And Patty, I just want to make one comment on Lisa's discussion around filters. I want people to understand this isn't necessarily just filtering out at the home level, like in your own personal washer and dryer. This could be potentially filtering during the creation and the production process of the material. Since the material is being washed there so many times in the first place, is there a way to potentially design out a lot of the shedding in the first place, or capture a lot of those shedded materials before it even makes it to the consumer-facing marketplace?
Yeah. And the science really shows that most of the shedding happens at the beginning of new materials, and about 90% of microfibers can be captured in the wash. So it seems like that's an effective solution. Having things like filters built automatically into washing machines could be an effective solution.
Patty, did you have a response?
Yes. Sorry, I would like to add up to what Lisa is saying, and I think that these solutions are also directed to the end life of certain products. I think that solutions should also be very much into upstream, and when I mean upstream is from production and resource extraction. So I think that right now one of the most innovative solutions that there could be would be how can we phase out single-use plastics that we are using and that end up being microplastics when once environment, and how can we stop using them? How can we convince the industry and corporations to stop uh, wrapping absolutely everything single-use plastic that
Mhm.
not long ago they were not being used.
Mhm.
So we believe now, and we have gotten the perception that we need all this single-use plastic, but there would be no better solution than not have to deal with these materials in the first place. So for clothing it might be more complicated, but for wrapping certain things and for producing certain uh, wrapping products for food, I'm just seeing how things that like were wrapped in carton, for instance, yesterday or last week. Now I go to the shop, to the grocery store, and now they are in sachets, in sachets, in kind of like sachets with a ziploc. Like this was not here last week. Now we got it. So it's like it's a solution is also try to see the system in a different way in which we stop it. We don't want this single-use plastic that is not really necessary.
Mhm.
Try to make things more reusable, try to make things more like old stuff, how we had it before. It was much better than what we have now, and I think that to me that would be some of the most innovative ones, how to counteract the forever growing product
Mhm.
plastic with, let's go backwards and let's try to fight like this willingness to keep growing limitless, like with no limits. Like let's try to stay when it comes to plastic. Let's try to grow a little bit, because this is not good for the planet. We cannot manage it, and the way we are managing it is completely horrendous for many people.
Yeah,
In
thanks, Patty. And what you were kind of getting at is the ever expanding economy that we
yeah,
see. A
yeah,
lot of people will look at the opposite of that and try to look at biomimicry. Look at how does nature produce. Nature does produce in abundance. Nature really does produce in abundance, but there's a steady state of abundance. And so how do we move towards more of a steady state economy? And I think that's something that a lot of these technological or innovative solutions are really looking towards. And it is complex. There is the whole transition to the reuse economy. Looking at the reuse economy, it's what are some of those reuse systems going to be made of? What's the material? We don't want to use fossil fuel based material. So where do alternative materials fit in there? To your point, Patty, is every single thing going to be able to fit into a reusable system? Are we going to have major difficulties if we try to limit a corporation's product portfolio? Is that even a possibility? How does that affect the economy and jobs for people that are working in those systems? It's more complex than simply just saying this is one solution, the reuse economy, it's going to work for everything. So,
Mhm.
for example, I want people to understand different solutions might pair together, and it sometimes needs to act as if a complicated puzzle needs to be put together. And that's where the research that both Patty and Lisa is doing is really helping to put those pieces of the puzzle together in a more digestible manner. So I would love to kick it over to the questions from the Q&A from the audience. And there was actually a really good question coming off of what I said, which is, do you see an increase in governmental research on plastic pollution? So you two being researchers, what do you see that governments are actually doing? I know we have the upcoming intergovernmental negotiating committees for the global treaty. But are governments looking to researchers such as yourself, or are they taking on these issues within their own government structure?
There's some government research, of course. Government research can be hugely effective when you look at long-term monitoring. You have the resources to be able to look at, say, wastewater and at a wastewater treatment plant and see whether a ban on microbeads is effective by monitoring wastewater over time and seeing the change in the types of microplastics that are really there. But governments can only do so much. There's a lot of research on plastic pollution, and it's really grown in recent years. So governments are looking to the scientists that are doing this work, trying to gather that expertise and go to the negotiating table informed by science.
Thanks. There's another question about bioplastics not all being biodegradable. And the question was, may we emphasize that not all bioplastics are biodegradable? So these alternative materials, they're not all created equally. Biodegradable does not necessarily equal compostable. And more information about that is going to be discussed in our upcoming Better Alternatives 3.0 report with visual evidence of testing these products in the natural environment for 18 months. So to answer your question, I really hope you just stick around until early 2023 and check out our report. There was a question that came up regarding organic materials and then making up the chemicals that end up in the environment. The question is there a way to classify these chemicals knowing that they are all derivatives of organic molecules, which lends insight into their bioactive benefits or toxicology? And correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't the term persistent organic pollutants?
Yeah. The chemicals that will persist in the environment, that they cause harm and that they're not easily broken down, they're the persistent organic pollutants. And we do know a lot about these persistent organic pollutants just from theoretical work. Molecules that are bigger and bulkier and less likely to be broken down can be persistent, can be toxic, and harmful to wildlife when they're exposed. But that theoretical work only tells us so much. There's a lot of transformation of different molecules in the environment. For the example of PFASs, what we know about Teflon, there's over time gone to different size molecules, but we know that these new replacements can actually transform into what the old toxic molecules were, or even cause more of an effect. So I think we do know a little bit just by looking at the chemical structure of some of these, and that helps us map out or select candidates of what the most harmful chemicals could be. But still, there's lots that happens in the environment when those chemicals are entering the environment and entering us. And some of those transformations and some of those effects and mixtures with other chemicals can be hard to predict.
Thank you for that. And we have time for one, depending on how long your answers are, we have time for one or two more questions. And I'm actually going to go back to, I think, the first question that was asked, because this is a good one. If you could wave a magic wand, what would be the most effective actions that the US government could enact to reduce plastic production, use, and pollution? Lisa, you want to bust out your magic wand?
Oh man, there's so many things I would do if I had a magic wand, and there's really, I think turning down the dial on production is probably the first one. If I just had a genie lamp and one wish, I would really want to dial that back. But my magic wand pointing at a solution for textiles will be very different than fishing gear in the middle of the ocean. So it's really hard to solve it all by one fell swoop. But the production we know is increasing at an exponential rate. it's no longer plan B for the fossil fuel industry. It's really become their plan A. And with just the overwhelming amount of plastic that is produced, we see these massive environmental effects when it enters the environment, or even in extraction and production, like Patty really mentioned. Where's the harm? There's a lot of communities who have been unfairly impacted by that massive increase in production.
Thank you, Lisa. And Patty, do you want to give any closing thoughts on this with your magic wand?
Well, I think that plastic, even though there's imperfection, I think in an ideal world, there would be some plastic that is still necessary, right, to be used to maintain the lifestyles that, I mean, in like furniture and automobiles and electronic devices. If I could make recycling actually workable, I would use my magic wand for that. Fortunately, recycling is not being very playing a big game right now. We know that less than 10% of everything ever produced is being recycled. So that would be my hope, that recyclability scales up and it's much better than what it is right now and less toxic.
Thank you, Patty. And for those who are on the call that work in the recycling field, we know it's very complex. We know you want materials to be more standardized across the product categories and not just by brand. So we hear you, we feel you, we love you for the hard work that you're doing, and thanks for the role you are playing in solutions to plastic pollution. So we are at time. This conversation has been recorded. Stay tuned to 5gyres.org and our social channels to see where it's going to be living. Would love to thank Dr. Lisa Ertl and PhD candidate Patty Villarrubia Gomez for giving us their time, knowledge, and wisdom today. Thank you so much, Patty. We hope you do an awesome job at the global treaty negotiations starting soon, sending you lots of good vibes to lead the charge for us. And we hope to see everybody who tuned in to this panel. We hope to see you in 2023. Have a happy holiday this week and holiday season, and we will see you soon. Thanks, everybody.
Ciao, thank you very much.